Well, I think if we're talking about a decade ago, or go back two decades, we have seen, some changes, I think, in the way the culture, at least the American culture, but I think the European culture too, the way divorce is now viewed. And that's different than it used to be. I don't know, the one thing I don't know that has changed over many years, even because my research internationally was 30 years ago, what we found and what I don't think changes is the emotional process. I think we've changed the legal process. I think we think differently about divorce. I think the expectations, a big shift is that the expectations now are that parents will divorce and they will do it decently. They will not fight. Rather than our earlier perception, which was, of course, they must fight, or why otherwise they wouldn't get a divorce. I think it's a very difficult shift for the legal practice. They have their problems. I mean, we have collaborative divorce here, and there's collaborative divorce I don't know about in Russia. I know in many of the European countries there's different models of collaborative divorce. And so I think the attorneys are trying to be collaborative, and some of them make it, but some of them do not. It's a big shift. I think in some countries it is quite common. Now, some of it has to do, I think, if my book was translated in certain countries so that those countries are more aware of it. I think the Scandinavian countries, perhaps even ahead of us, Norway especially, certainly was ahead of us. But I think Germany has made some shifts. I get, and where I get it from is when people write to me and ask me questions and tell me what's going on in their country. Or I should say, and there are many students all over the world doing dissertations that are looking at more cooperative divorces by nuclear family. I mean, they're beginning, I hear the term, people will write me using the term. So that is a beginning. I wish that I were able to continue the research. And it's very costly, as you well know, and that money is no longer available. And I've retired from the university, and I'm doing mostly practice again, which is sort of coming back to where I was 30 years ago, and now I'm going to have time for that. I think if I could do research today more than I would want to know the longer term outcomes. I'd like to know in 5 years, for example, if people had a more collaborative approach, how they would compare with those that did not have the collaborative approach. Has it really made a difference over time? Five years, I think, gives us a longer term perspective. If we go 1 year, people really have not settled in on their new lives. 2 years, there's a lot of recoupling. So again, the system is a little bit, in chaos as these new families pull together again. But by 5 years, there's some settling down. Of course, there's some redivorces by then too, but there is some stabilization, I think. As you know, I interviewed the couples at 3 years post-divorce and at 5 years post-divorce. And if we're looking for longer-term effects, I think we have to go out to 5 years. If we're looking for how has the family stabilized, and if we're looking at mental health issues, we can look, I think, better at 3 years. At 1 year post-divorce, I think we're still seeing a family that is not settled in yet. Well, I think the main criteria is related to children. We really are not concerned if there are no children. So if they can continue to be good parents, have relationships with their children, communicate sufficiently well to be able to make decisions around the children. Now, I don't think that that means that there's closure around the divorce. We're always asking for closure or neutrality. I don't even think that there has to be neutrality. They just have to work well enough to say how they're going to conduct their relationships with the children. They have to be able to ease the transitions from home to home for the children. They have to plan for the children. They have to be able to communicate with each other. What did we do with Johnny today? He wasn't acting this way. He didn't take his nap. He didn't sleep well. I'm dealing with children who might have, medical problems, like one boy I'm dealing with now who has seizures. And there's a difference of opinion between the parents as to what activates these seizures, and what, mom says that dad doesn't give the child an adequate nap because he naps with the child on the beach. I live in a beach community. So they have to be able to talk sufficiently well to not intrude on the children's lives. I mean, that's our major concern. Can they cooperate just enough? If they can do more, that's wonderful. When I see parents who are really able to talk to each other, I don't see too much of that in the immediacy. Certainly it may show up 2, 3, 5, 10 years later, where they're finally able to talk to each other, just as people, and not be all entangled with what went on in the marriage. But I know that therapists and people sometimes want closure. Let's talk about where the marriage fell apart, what went wrong, what we did. I don't think that happens if they're in therapy and it's marital work and family work. It's not divorce so much. Then you know what the picture looks like in the marriage. But once they start divorce proceedings, you don't get a good picture of the marriage anymore because there's so much anger. I think that once the divorce has been decided on, it's not like we've been seeing the couple for years before, but if they come in to our path, whether it's therapy, whether it's through collaborative work or into something, once they do that, it does become structural. And because it gives them a way to go. You help them set boundaries. You help them be able to just be able to run their lives in such a way that they are still family, that they can still occasionally do things together, that the children are not afraid to be with them, with both in their presence. And that is mostly structural work, I think. And I don't see people go into divorce therapy. Years ago, I thought that there really would be divorce therapy. I don't see much of that anymore. And one of the things I've been thinking about lately, when divorce is as common as it is, not only in the U.S., across the world, I think Russia's rate may be a little higher than the U.S. at this point, but it varies. It doesn't make any difference. We can't even tell divorce rates anymore because so many people don't marry. But they have children and they do split up. They don't show up in the divorce rates. But what I would like to see, and maybe this is another pipe dream, is a normalization of couples that part of the divorce process is working with a mental health professional that helps them structure their relationship. That it not so much be seen as therapy. It should be a normative part. Look, this is a hard thing to do. It's important educationally to educate the parents and teach them what new roles they can have, so that it's taken in some ways out of the therapy arena, which makes people think something's wrong with them and so on. In the best of all worlds, it would be nice if, as people were divorcing, that they worked with a family therapist and the kids and the whole family toward a good divorce. I think that is rare. At least it's rare from my point of view that I see it. I would like to do more of that work, but they don't tend to want that kind of work when they have already made the decision and moved on. Where you have an opportunity to work with people while they are making their decision, before they contact a lawyer, before they move forward, then we have some opportunity to work with them. And then I think you work with the whole family, you work with the couple, and you also work with them individually. One of the things I think that rarely gets accomplished in a divorce, but is one of a major issue that they need to accomplish, and that is grieving. They don't grieve the losses because of the anger. They grieve them later on individually. But wouldn't it be nice if they could share a little bit of that grieving, and in some way, with some ritual perhaps, but in some way be able to say, you know, there were good parts to our marriage, and then there were parts that didn't work, and I'm sad for the future, you know, sad that we're not going to have what we had planned on and the trips we planned on and so on. But to really be able to grieve the loss of all of the future things that they had anticipated. I find that sometimes the individual will come in, and oftentimes a year after divorce will come in and be ready to do that kind of work individually. But getting the former spouse then to come back in is very difficult. And most times it's the women who come in, which is true in general, as you know, that come in, but the husbands think it's unnecessary and don't come in. So it's, you know, sometimes the best work that we can do is if we are seeing the couple in therapy and they make a decision that they want to split up in some way, but they're still working with us. Show that the data show that what they do is they very quickly recouple. In most of the situations that I'm now working on in collaborative divorces, and I think at 5 or 6 of them right now, and they're men that are in their late 30s, early 40s. They've already have somebody. The women don't tend to recouple that quickly. And they are able, therefore, to grieve their losses a little bit and so on. The men have already moved on, so that there's no room to really grieve because, you know, you fall in love, and when you fall in love, that takes over your life. And that's wonderful. And so many of these men are there already and have the woman on the side, you know, that they're just waiting to move in. And of course, that makes it worse for the wife, you know, soon to be former wife, to deal with the fact that there's going to be another woman with her children. That, for me, has become a very big issue, is the recoupling issue. That they do feel some guilt if they initiated, but even if they didn't initiate, if they, you know, have a lover outside, yes, even then they may feel some guilt, but they're hard to contact. It's hard to get the men to talk about that. That's true. In some ways, at the negotiating table, it's better when they feel a little guilty because they're willing to pay more. That's true. I mean, that's the price of their guilt, I guess they feel, because I watch them then that they soften when it comes to money, or if she wants an extra day, you know, a week or something, they're softer about that, and that is usually tied to their guilt. Well, the importance of it is for the children, of course, to understand that they're still family and that to normalize it, and they have family in 2 households. What's important to it, though, is because it says that there are these relationships that are still there, that it's important that the paternal grandmother, for example, see the children and keep that relationship, and aunts and uncles and cousins. So it really says, the message about it is, okay, we're getting a divorce. We don't live together any longer. But these are kinship ties. And if we can keep those kinship ties working well, then we have a binuclear family that's working well. Where you don't, I'm picturing a diagram in my mind, and where you don't see the cutoffs. So do you mean if you have in your office, if you have both former spouses and the children, now if they've recoupled, do you have the recoupled partners in?
Yeah.
That's a big unit already, or even if grandparents are in the middle of this divorce in one way or another, and you bring them in. So yes, it's a large group to work with. And it often works best for me when I work with a group that size, that I make sure that each individual has a chance to be heard. And each individual is asked. And I often start with the youngest. And just ask them, well, what do you think's going on? How are you feeling about this? What's happening in your life now? And then move around. I don't so much say problems or issues, because they're going to come out anyway. But I try to just frame it like, okay, we are working towards something, and there are a lot of barriers for us to have to deal with. How are we going to do it? More and more, how are mom and stepmom going to get along sufficiently well so that it doesn't get in the way of the children's development, in the way of the children's lives? And that's become, that's a big issue. And they don't have very much, where to go with it. Where I see larger family units is in remarriages. So they're remarried for a couple of years, and it all becomes difficult. He's got kids, she's got kids. Maybe they even decide to have a child together, which is, called the concrete baby, keeps the new marriage together. That unit will often come in because after a year or two, they develop problems. And oftentimes the problems are tied to the former spouse. Whatever, let's say that this is a man who's remarried in a family, and his ex-wife, so his new wife is really concerned about what is this relationship with his ex-wife about.
That's true.
Why does he talk to her so much? What's going on? And she feels very left out. So that new unit has trouble putting itself together when there's conflict still between the ex-spouses. It's a little easier when there's not conflict, if somebody's really moved on and they no longer feel that anger. And they're not angry, this is another hard thing, and they're not angry that there's a new partner in there, who is part of their lives. But that's where I'm seeing the larger units now. Not so much in the divorcing family, but in the post-divorce family. Well, and they're often the most honest. So that's important too, is that they will, if they're not fearful of talking, they're often going to just say things. They just sort of blurt them out. And in the meantime, we're watching everybody else's reaction in the family to see how they're reacting to this. The child is saying things and like, where did that come from? So it gives them a voice. Kids don't often have a voice. And everybody's listening to them. That's different. Well, it depends on if you have the new spouse and there are no other children. See, the difficulty is when there's a new spouse, oftentimes that new spouse has children. And they're trying to integrate all these children. And that takes time, and sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work. Yes, but I would have the form, the new spouse in. I don't know about the children. I think it would depend on what the issues are. What was going on that I was called in some way to intervene? What was happening? I use the word less now. I use the word therapy less than I used to. I think so, with young children. With older children, it doesn't work too well. I mean, they are not into encompassing this. But let's say the 5-year-old, the 6 and the 7, 8-year-old, I think they can see it if you draw a picture for them and, talk about what that is, and that their family is just structurally different. But there's a lot of families like them out there. They're not alone, like that used to be 30 years ago. I mean, now that's not alone. And I often ask them, do you have any friends whose parents are separated or divorced? And what's that like? And so you begin to say, in a way, this is part of what's going on. These are the changes. This is pretty normal. But you do have a family. And let's give it a name, only because the first married family has a name. I think if they're trained in systems work, so if they're trained as family therapists, if they're in postgraduate programs of family therapy or in graduate programs of family therapy, they're much more apt to learn this and much more to think of and to understand this broader system. But that's not so for everybody. I mean, if somebody has their background as a psychologist, background as psychodynamic work, doesn't really have knowledge of systems theory, is not likely to think in those terms. I think if you have severe personality disorders, one of the persons has severe personality disorder, you're not going to make a good divorce out of that one. You can give it a good try, but it's not likely to happen. If you have somebody who is a narcissist, for example, you're not going to be able to get that person to make much change. And yes, so I've seen some divorces that no matter how hard we try, and I think one of the things in working on a collaborative team, we always ask ourselves, are we working harder than the family? And frequently we are, because we are so determined, and then it doesn't work. Well, I think, any kind of work where we can continue to work with his family a little bit, because oftentimes, they get through the divorce, they get done, and they don't want any part of us as mental health professionals. They're done. But if you can continue to work, and what happens is, if there's so much conflict around the child, then the parents need to work together. Oftentimes the courts require that they see high conflict counselors. Now, I don't know that any of the high conflict counselors are trying to put them together in groups. I know we do have some high conflict families in a program that we run here, which is 4 weeks long, and both spouses participate, but they're in separate groups, and the children are in groups according to developmental ages. And they all have groups, but they don't get together. They don't take the whole family together. And they do that's been a very successful program as far as we can tell. But that's been good work. And mediation is very common here now. That's wonderful.